Hello,
Oh,
everybody.
I love it when we see all those names appear on the screen.
Yeah.
Welcome, everyone.
After last week's problem, it's so good to see you all.
And thank you, everyone, for being so kind about last week's problem. This time last week, Wendy and I were shooting off a flurry of emails to each other, trying to work out what we were going to do next. We'll just wait a couple more minutes before we start. While we're waiting, I've just been complaining about how hot it is over here, but I suspect I'm the only one. I hear it's pretty cold over in North America at the moment.
It is here, definitely.
Okay, so we're 22 people so far have come in, so that's a good thing.
Yep. I think we'll probably just start straight on time, but which is in about a minute, and then just let people in as they appear.
Yep.
Wendy, are you okay to be handling the waiting room while you're chatting?
Yeah, I'm fine. Yep. Fine.
I apologize in advance. I have a finicky dog who keeps coming in and out of the door. So
that is the best thing about the 2020s is everybody's dogs and cats that join in on Zoom calls. So
yes, they do.
So don't feel bad about the finicky dog. If anything, we'll demand to see him or her.
She is a cutie.
Right, well, I might go ahead and start, Wendy, if you're happy with that.
Sure, that'd be fine.
Erin? Okay, so I'd just like to welcome everybody. My name is Sally. I'm one of your co-hosts, and I'm calling in from Australia at the moment. And it's really great to see both a whole lot of regular names and some new names coming in there. I wonder, just to get an idea, if it is your first time here, did you want to raise a hand? Not everyone has their camera on. You can welcome Emily, Susan. Great to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you. California.
California, okay.
Welcome.
I'm West Coast Canada, Vancouver.
Okay.
Great. That's great to see. And I can see Marilyn.
I'm from Toronto. Yep, Toronto, Canada.
Okay.
Fantastic. Welcome. Welcome. It's really good to have everyone here, and I expect we'll have a few more people coming in a little later as we start going. And for those of you who tried to get in last week and had hassles, just want to say thank you very much for persevering, and for everyone being so understanding about it. So please feel free to drop a message in the chat. Some of us like to rename our profiles with the location that we're dialing in from, or else you could just drop it in the chat because it's quite fun to see where everyone's from. And if it is your first time here, it would be great if you tell us how you heard about our book club, because it's always good to know how. Also, just a bit of housekeeping, just a few little announcements that I need. If you're not a member of our Facebook group, which is called Solo Travel Wisdom, that's a group where we share travel tips and chats about our upcoming books, and we'd love it. It's also a general group talking about travel advice, sharing travel memories. So it's a great community to be in there. And I'll post links to that in a little bit going, as well as links to our upcoming book clubs. Popping things in the chat. Now I'm getting a message that says my internet is unstable. Are people able to hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, you froze a couple times, but you're pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry about that. So while we're doing that, I just do have a message on behalf of the JourneyWoman CEO, who's usually here. She's traveling in Europe at the moment and can't be here, but she has said that she would like to emphasize that at Journey, we strive to be a place where all women are welcome, and that we are committed to creating the safest space possible with the intention of helping to unearth the true value of each person who joins this community. And as we start, I want to acknowledge that wherever we are in the world today, the land where we are standing is the traditional territory of many nations. And we wish to acknowledge and thank the first peoples of this territory and other Indigenous people for sharing their land in order for us to continue our work today. So this month in Feb, we've been reading The Memory Keeper of Kyiv, a novel about a traumatic and unfortunately highly topical subject at the moment. Usually how we run our book clubs is we distribute some questions for people to think about beforehand. They are optional questions. Nobody has to answer them, but just help people to think while they read about some discussion points. And then we have a structured conversation where we follow a number of those questions. But this time is different. We are so lucky to have the author here today. Erin, welcome. We're very excited that you're here with us.
I'm honored to be here. Thank you for having me.
That's great. Thank you. Before handing over to Wendy, who is our book club host, I do want to mention that while our book club is free, Erin has requested that we make donations to Nova Ukraine, which is a non-profit organization dedicated to providing humanitarian aid to the people of Ukraine and to raising awareness about Ukraine in the United States and throughout the world. I will put the fundraising link in the chat, as well as the link to our regular donations page, which we always include for optional donations. And now I think that's enough from me. I'll hand over to Wendy to introduce Erin.
Hello, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm so glad to see a lot of new people today. And there's a couple we have 2 pages of people, so I will be flipping back and forth to make sure that when we get to question time that I see your hands raised to be able to get into speaking with you. I'm Wendy Brooke. I am in Montgomery, Alabama in the United States, where it's been unseasonably cool this week, but not cold like the northern climate. So I had the pleasure last week with the kerfuffle, at least I had the chance to speak to Erin a couple of times saying, okay, hold on, we're trying to get in. So I had a chance to speak with her briefly last week, and Erin lives in rural, I'd say a small town, rural Illinois, but outside of the St. Louis, Missouri area. And this is her debut novel. And I think it's great when we see a debut novel that has really already sort of hit the shelves and made a big impact. It won the Best Historical Fiction of 2022 by She Reads. It's gotten a lot of good acclaim. So, and it is a very timely topic because it is about Ukraine. It's about Ukraine during Stalin's period of time. But to me, when I read it, one of the things that it made me realize, first of all, I knew nothing about the Holodomor, which we'll talk about in a minute. But it also made me realize the long-term turmoil between Ukraine and Russia. You know, we think about it being a fairly new thing with the Crimean situation and today, but it goes back historically, generation after generation, with this conflict. And I think sometimes I think, and I hate to say this, I know there's some people on JourneyWoman that sometimes have expressed that they feel that Canada gets overshadowed by the United States. Well, I think about a very small country like Ukraine really being overshadowed by Russia, you know, such a large nation next to it. But it really brought to me that long-term generational divide between the two countries. It also brought out to me the long-term fierceness and independence of the Ukrainian people that we are seeing today. That really, fighting for what they believe in. And in our story, where people did not want to follow Stalin, did not want to go along with his rule, that fierceness to try to fight against it. And so, again, things that we see today, we also see throughout the history in the nations. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to, I'll start with Erin, just asking you, can you tell me a little, just give us the plot of the book, from your perspective, and tell us a little about the book, and then we'll talk a little bit about your inspiration for the book.
Sure. So the story begins with Katya. In my head, it always began with Katya. She is a young woman coming of age in Stalin's Ukraine at that time. He ruled Ukraine at that time, the Soviet Union. And at that point, they started in 1929, started collectivizing farming. And so Stalin wanted to take away all the private property and make Ukraine and all of the Soviet Union have these collective farms where everybody pooled all their land and their resources and worked together. And the Ukrainians were not fans of that. They were very fiercely independent. As you said, they wanted to keep their own farms. So it's her life as she comes of age during this turmoil, as Ukrainians start resisting and Stalin and his people start pushing down on them. And they end up creating this man-made famine, a terror famine, really, to suppress the Ukrainian resistance movement and stamp out Ukrainian nationalism. And so it's her life, her love, her trying to grow up and find herself in the midst of losing people all around her and doing her best to just stay alive. And then I wanted to really make this a dual timeline story because I wanted to show how that trauma echoed through the generations. And so the second part of the story is Cassie, who is Katya's granddaughter and has no idea what her grandmother went through because her grandmother buried it and kept it to herself. It was just too painful. And for a myriad of other reasons too, that we can get into. But I wanted to show how Cassie's life was affected by that and what she didn't know and her discovery of finding that, because I think far too often we discount the stories of our grandmothers or our ancestors. We don't always give it the power it deserves because it affects our lives. And so I wanted to show her discovering that and how her grandmother's strength echoed through the generations and inspired her on her own journey as Cassie deals with having lost her husband and trying to raise her daughter who is struggling after that loss, and how they come together as a family and try and heal that generational trauma and pain.
Great. It's when you, one of the things about, you said that the whole idea of that we don't necessarily listen to our grandparents, and it made me think about having dealt with my grandparents, what were their stories and how did that work? And what have I heard and understand from them? Erin, how did your grandparents, and particularly your Ukrainian grandparents, help you in terms of both the story and just in your outlook on that would cover the story?
So I think my love of history started with my Ukrainian great-grandmother. She lived with us when I was young, up until she passed. And so, her bedroom was just filled with pictures of places in Ukraine, the people that were left behind in Ukraine, the stories she would tell. And it just fascinated me from a very, very young age and inspired me to want to learn more. And so as I got older and started researching how her family stories fit into the real narrative of that history, I came across the Holodomor, which I knew there was a famine. I knew there was collectivization. I didn't realize the scope of it. I didn't realize the intentionality of it. And so her stories, while this isn't her stories to me inspired me to find out more about that past. And that's how this whole book began. When I found the Holodomor for myself and discovered how horrific it was. And I realized how many people didn't know about it because it was hidden for so long by the Soviet Union. And I just thought, this is a story that has to be told. People need to be aware of what happened. And now that we see similar things happening, it just reinforced that whole idea. So her stories affected me. Her son, my grandfather, had amazing stories too. And a lot of those stories were actually based in World War II as they fled Ukraine. So I have, that's a lot of inspiration for book 2, but that's another story. So yeah, and his brother, my great uncle, who is the only one that's still alive that went through all that. I talk to him regularly, a couple times a week. We FaceTime. He lives in Croatia. And so he's been an amazing help as I piece together these things and try and learn more that I don't know and ask all these questions. So yeah, the family aspect was everything for this book.
And so with having inspired your love of history, and for those of you, I should have said, your degree is in history, correct?
Yeah. Yes.
That's right. And one of the things about the Holodomor, the fact that it was covered up,
mm-hmm.
how was that in terms of researching it and trying to find out more about it? How did you go about doing that with it having been sort of swept under the covers?
So by the time I started, it had been started, people were starting to research it at that point. After the Soviet Union fell, they finally started opening up those files. Although Russia to this day still denies that it happened the way it did, but those stories started coming out. People were able to start looking in the archives and digging through things. And when I started, but there's still so much being done. When I started this book roughly 10 years ago, I started researching for this book. And even in that time, new books came out, new research came out that made me have to go back to the story and shift things and rearrange things because they were just finding more information all the time. And there's still this huge movement to try to educate people about it. I'm going to be part of a webinar consortium in the fall for a group. It's the Holodomor Research Institute for Education. They're trying to bring that awareness to schools and to the public so people realize what happened. So it's not an easy thing to find, but it is starting to get out there a lot more than it was.
And have you gone to Ukraine?
No, sadly not. I've had 3 trips planned, but COVID ruined 2 of them and this war ruined the third. My great uncle is going to go with me and take me to the village where my grandfather was born, where my great great grandfather was a priest, an Orthodox priest there. And we still have family there that I've talked on FaceTime, but hopefully things will settle down and I'll be able to get over there soon.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
My name is Larissa. I'm new here. I'm the president of the Ukrainian Culture Center in Los Angeles. And I just wanted to say hello and say hi to Erin also. We've talked over email. I'm super excited to be here. I'm super excited to hear everybody's perspective on Erin's book. It's so amazing, Erin, what you've done to get this book out there. I know for you, it's a very personal story. For all of us who are Ukrainian, it's an incredibly personal story. And, we're really running out of people who are the survivors. But Wendy, to your question, Robert Conquest did write a book about the Holodomor in the 80s. It's called Harvest of Sorrow. So some initial work was done before the fall of the Soviet Union. Okay. But I would also point you guys to Gareth Jones, who was a journalist from England who went to Ukraine during the Holodomor. He went initially as a journalist to Moscow to observe how reporting was being done there, and snuck out and made his way to Ukraine and saw firsthand what was happening. And he was literally the only journalist from that time who got the story out to the West. And there's a movie that you can watch on Amazon called Mr. Jones. It's very disturbing. It's got a lot of images that are very difficult to deal with, but it does tell the story of how in a time when there was no internet and when things were very strict with Stalin in power, he was able to get the story out. He was ultimately murdered by the KGB, I believe in Africa, years after he got the story to the West. But Walter Duranty, the official New York Times journalist who was in Moscow during the Holodomor and knew about the murder and genocide of Ukrainians, did not report a single word of it to the New York Times and was known as really Stalin's apologist. Won a Pulitzer Prize even for his work, and the New York Times refuses to take that Pulitzer Prize off their walls, despite the fact that 7 million Ukrainians were murdered.
And there's petitions going around that you can sign to try and get them to do that. But yeah, they have not done that yet. It's terrible.
You know, one of the things about the book itself was not just about Ukraine, but it's about family and healing, and how family together can bring about healing. Can you talk a little bit about the Cassie?
Yeah, I think you know, I think it goes back to what I was saying about how it's so important to know what your ancestors endured, because not only does that shape them, and they shape us. So without knowing what they went through and understanding that, we can't understand ourselves. We can't truly know them without knowing that. And so that family coming together and the cohesion and the understanding there, I think, is vital for moving on and for learning how to cope with things. I think with Cassie's story, seeing what her grandmother endured and how she persevered and found her strength inspired her. And I think there's a lot of those lessons we can learn from the people that came before us. And I just want to say a quick thank you to Larissa. That was excellent information. And they're wonderful resources. Harvest of Sorrows was one of the first books I read about the Holodomor, and really got me going down this path too.
Let me ask a question before we get on with the book. Has anybody here been to Ukraine before? Has anybody traveled to Ukraine? Let me just check on the other page. Oh, yeah. Larissa, you have. Okay. Let me see on page 2. Anybody on page 2 having been to Ukraine? So it's an area that we have not explored yet from right now it's hard to say a tourist area because of the war, but even prior to the war, having not been. So, and I'm wondering, Erin or Larissa, can you tell us what are a couple of the highlights, or the Holodomor is the tragedy is what's happened, but if one was to go visit Ukraine, what are a couple of those places that everyone should see? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'll defer to Larissa since she's been there before me. I have thoughts to where I want to go, but if she's been there, please do.
Gosh. Well, I think that I would sort of give you sort of a couple of overriding perspectives about the country and things that I've learned, especially with a lot of refugees that we've been dealing with that are coming here, is that, Ukraine is a very pluralist and diverse society. And I think that's one of the most surprising things about it for me. If you like in the United States, you know how you've got like an East Coast accent, you've got a Southern accent, you've got a Midwest accent. They've got the exact same thing going on. So you meet people from different regions of Ukraine, and when they're not speaking from the region that you're from, like my family's from Western Ukraine, you really have to pay attention to what they're saying. So like sometimes when I've been to the South, no offense to anybody, I need subtitles, folks. Yeah. I'm from Chicago. It's the same thing there. So generally speaking, so if you think about it, like, okay, this is a very diverse place. It's diverse religiously, it's diverse politically. So keeping that in mind, each region will have its own flavor for that reason. I think that if you go, you have to go to Kyiv. It's very important. The Kyiv Opera House, and then there are words I know in Ukrainian that I don't know in English. Pечерська Лавра, it's the main Orthodox church in Kyiv that has been under the Moscow Patriarch for a long time, even though it's Ukrainian and it's very complicated, but it is one of the most historic churches that you can see there. And then, of course, in Western Ukraine, going to the city of Lviv is very important. It feels like you feel like you've just been dropped into the middle of Europe somewhere. It has a lot of charm, a lot of typical Western European charm. And then, of course, going to Odessa and going to the sea, it's the Riviera of Ukraine. And so getting to the water and being on the Black Sea, I think, is a huge opportunity. As far as the East goes, it's been so destroyed, the equivalent of like Syria, right? It's been reduced to ash and rubble. So at this point, you know, anything that was culturally or historically relevant there is gone, right? So a couple of things, right? It's either been destroyed by bombs or it's been stolen, right? The Russian museums are filled with artifacts stolen from Ukraine for the last, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years. So that's all gone now. So I would say pretty much from Kyiv west and south, and then of course north of Kyiv, I think that there are even tours not too far from Chernobyl that are actually quite fascinating because of the way that life has started to come back there after the disaster. So I think a ton of opportunity, and then really understanding if you can get like a farm tour where you get to really learn what Chornozem means. Chornozem means the black earth, that very, very rich soil that has allowed Ukraine to be the breadbasket of Europe for so many centuries, and what distinguishes it from other countries and why it's been so coveted by so many countries for so many years. If you can get to know the farming community or go on like a farming tour, I would highly recommend that as well. There is nothing like the fresh milk and butter and, you know, potatoes grown in that black earth. Like it just tastes completely different from any place else in the world.
Thank you. And Erin, what were the, yes.
Larissa, I was just wondering, or Erin, but just given that Larissa was just talking about the farming, I mean, we've been learning through your book about what happened with the collectivization of farms. And I was just wondering what the farming landscape looks like now. Do they tend to just be large mass farms, or are there smaller kind of family run or community run farms as well?
Erin, I don't know if you were going to take that.
Oh, no, go ahead. If you know, I know where my family lives, they have a small farm, but I don't know how it is across Ukraine, right?
I don't know the statistics, to be quite honest with you, Sally, but I can tell you that what I've heard through the grapevine is that a lot of the farming has gone corporate, like the United States, right? That's been, you know, one of the biggest fears in Ukraine is like when that's your core competency and it's being sold to large corporations that are foreign corporations, I think it's a problem, right? But I do think that the balance is probably still in favor of the individual farmer at this point.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
To me, the fact that it was the breadbasket, and it was, you know, a lot of its strength was from the farming community. Having grown up in the rural Midwest and understanding the independence and the strength of farmers, it makes me understand sort of that strength of the people themselves. The fierce independent farmer can be quite fierce and quite independent. So, which I think we see in the book. You know, we see that, you know, in Katya's family, they are resisting Stalin. They don't understand why they should have to collectivize when they're just doing fine on their own. It's like, why work for them when we're doing fine? So I think we're at a point where let's start opening up to questions. Anybody, we can do questions three different ways. You can either raise your hand or raise your hand using the monitor, the little down below hand raise on the screen. Or if you prefer, you can put it in the chat, and we'd be glad to field any questions. And
a question.
Yes, Gillian.
Okay. When Erin was talking, beside her there is an embroidered cloth. Is that one of the embroidered cloths that you were referring to in your book? Is that something your grandmother made?
That is something my grandmother made, my great-grandmother, yes. But it's not a ruchnik, but it is just made for decoration.
On the other side. On the other side. On your
yes. Yes, that is. Yes. My great uncle actually brought me that. That's from my family in Ukraine made that. And so he brought that when he came to visit for me.
Okay. And that would be used. I know you said that she had that over her religious icons, but they also use that when they're getting married to wrap the hands of the people that are getting married.
Yes, they were just any type of, from what I understand, and Larissa can correct me if I'm wrong, but they had different ones that they would use for different purposes. So a mother would embroider a special one for her daughter to use for that, or have a family one. And then you had certain ones that you'd hang over your icons. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
It's more of a ceremonial type towel in a way.
I enjoyed your book very much. It was very difficult to read a lot of parts of it, but thank you for educating us.
Oh,
hi, Erin. This is Roberta Burson in Sarasota, Florida, and I had read your book. I couldn't put it down.
Oh,
but I read Alina Adams' book first, The Nesting Dolls, and I wish I had read your book first, because her book takes place after yours for people that were in there like in the 70s in Moscow. And then
okay, I haven't read that yet. I'll have to write that down.
Yeah, and the Nesting Dolls, it's excellent. But yours told me about the Holodomor. My mother came in 1919 with her parents and her two brothers, but she would never remember anything. And then my grandmother didn't talk to a little toddler about what happened. And from my generation, we really maybe weren't interested until maybe 10, 15 years ago. And now we're getting all the information. But I do have a good friend who came here after she finished college in Ukraine. She came in Kyiv. She came to America to learn English, to teach, because she wanted to go back and teach in high school. So here she got a job as a nanny. Well, then she ended up meeting someone. She got married, got her citizenship. But every time I saw her, which was regularly, she talked to me about Ukraine. Even now she's sending me information because her mother and her brother and their families are still there. And it's so upsetting to see what's happening now, because reading those two books, it told me what happened then.
So much has happened there.
But your book was excellent. I mean, the idea of it, the grandmother was a wonderful figure to have in there, because she took us back to what she was going through. And today, and then it really gives us pause to how people coming to live here and having endured all that we have a good life.
Yeah. Yes.
And I'm appreciative every time I read a book like yours. And it really was very eye-opening, and I cried the whole end. The whole
thank you so much for reading.
I just couldn't, but it was just beautiful. And thank you for enriching my life as well as so many others. I'm sure, which I'm sure you did.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Roberta.
Carol.
Wendy, just drawing your attention, Susan Weber's hand up.
Yeah, I saw Susan and Carol both. So we'll go Susan first and then Carol.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Erin, I have a question for you, and it's about the title that you chose for this book. As we've already mentioned, a lot of the book is about the rural farm people, and yet the title is about Kyiv. So was that your hook, so that people would know the book was about Ukraine?
In a way. So the book takes place, it's set in, oh my goodness, I just left my light over. Sorry. The book takes place in the Kyiv Oblast, or back then it was the Okruta. But yes, when talking with my publisher, the book was always set there, but this was before the war, and my publisher said, people aren't going to necessarily know. I had different titles that I wanted. They wanted people to realize this book was about Ukraine. So what can we pull from the book that you have that will maybe link people to understand that it's Ukraine? And since I had it set in the Kyiv Oblast, they thought that would be a way to help people realize where it was set.
How badly is that area hurt now with the current war?
Around Kyiv? In the rural, in the south where my book is set, I think, sorry, my light keeps falling. I will ignore it. Yeah, so I think that whole area there in central and eastern Ukraine is pretty devastated. And that specific area itself, I don't know in that specific, where I based it in the Tetiv Rayon. So I couldn't tell you specifically there. Sorry.
Thank you.
Carol. She's gonna have to. She's unmuting herself. So.
Oops, sorry about that. I don't usually do it on the iPad. I'm so sorry. What a wonderful book. I was captivated by it. And it really did bring a lot more understanding to the situation that's happening now. So I really appreciate the book club for picking it now, and Erin, you for writing it. And something I thought really resonated in a different way for me, I think, than it would have before the war or before the pandemic maybe, was the way that people turned on each other in the town when the collectives were being created. And I wondered what kind of research you did to understand that situation.
So that was interesting. That was one of Stalin's tactics too. He specifically wanted that falling apart of the community. And so in creating the fight against the kulaks to try and separate them, so it did the work for him. It helped break down the fabric of their society, breaking down their churches, breaking down their religious ceremonies, taking away all those things that were so vital to a vibrant Ukrainian village, and turning the villagers against each other, helped him with what he wanted to achieve. And so in researching that, I read a lot of firsthand accounts of people talking about how neighbors would turn against each other. And that's how I base a lot of my research. I love really trying to imagine what the people specifically went through. You can read about facts all day, you can read about the statistics, but when you read about someone's firsthand account of how their nephew turned them in for hiding food, and then they were arrested, and to see people turning, that brainwashing going on and that division from a firsthand account, it hits differently than reading a statistic in a book.
Well, you did a great job portraying that, so I appreciated it.
Thank you.
If I could add on to that, Erin, just for the group, the reason that that's such an important story to tell is because it became part of a tactic of not only turning neighbor against neighbor, or brother against sister, or children against parents. It also became a tactic for breaking the generations, right? So by murdering 7 million people, you break those lines of generational living in a particular area. And then when you kill that many people, right? 7 million people out of, I don't know what the population was of Ukraine in the 30s, but when you kill, what is that, potentially 14% of the population, you have to replace them, right? And then you replace them with people who are Russian speaking, not Ukrainian speaking, and don't have loyalty to Russia. And so then flash forward to 2022, you have a public all around the world that is going, well, how come so many people in Russia or in Ukraine speak Russian?
Yes.
Well, because
absolutely
killed all of the people.
Who were 13%. Yes.
Right? So what it turns out to be is probably one of the most successful social engineering projects of all time.
Yes, absolutely. Well said.
Yeah, 13% of the population died during the Cold War.
Yes.
Dina, you had something?
Yeah, I was a history teacher and for 26 plus years. I subbed after I retired. And one of the classes that I taught was Eastern Europe. And all my training, of course, was prior to the fall of the Soviet Union. And I knew that the collectivization was a horrific failure. And I knew that that Stalin had swept up hundreds of thousands of people, and they're in mass graves, unmarked, in Siberia. But I didn't quite realize until your book, Erin, how intentional it was. I mean, not fully understood until that. It was just, it kind of weighed heavy on my heart that I didn't quite probably teach that in that way either, other than the evil of the authoritarianism and the failure of the collectivization, but that to know that was so intentional. Thank you for good history.
You're welcome. It shocked me as well to find out that level. And for me, knowing I had family who were from Ukraine and knowing that was part of my heritage and I wasn't aware, I felt like I'd betrayed everything before me, like not knowing that, like I felt it was terrible. So it makes me happy to know that it's helping to spread the word about it.
Yeah. Erin, how did you first find out about the Holodomor?
In researching Ukrainian history to find out more about what my great-grandparents went through during World War II, and just digging and came across it and thought, oh my gosh, how do I not know more about this? Talking to my family then, my grandpa saying, oh, well, yeah, you didn't know? Like, no, you never mentioned it. It's like, oh yeah, my family was from Western Ukraine. So they didn't live it. They were under Polish rule at that time, but they knew people, and they saw people who escaped before the borders closed, and they had their little snippets of stories that they passed down. And so I learned those then, but up until then, I had not realized how bad it was.
It's interesting, Erin, that you talk about how the firsthand accounts, bring so much immediacy to the facts. Mm-hmm. But I think that what you do as a novelist also has a role. I mean, while we can learn a lot from lists of facts, I think it takes a novel often to really communicate that empathy or allow people to empathize, because you take us into the heads of your characters. Mm-hmm. So thank you for doing that. I think a lot of people, I'd be interested to know how I had heard of the Holodomor before your book, Erin, but not before this year when we've become more aware of what's going on in Ukraine. And I wonder how many people in the group, Dina, knew about it. Did anyone else know? Mm-hmm. Not seeing any hands on the first screen.
No.
Yeah. Because I too, I'd heard about collectivization under Stalin, but I hadn't known how specifically it didn't only affect Ukraine, but it seems to have affected Ukraine far more intensely than the other areas where it was practiced.
Yes, that was intentional. It was specifically to stamp out the Ukrainian fight, the rebellion, the Ukrainian nationalism. Stalin saw Ukraine as a threat to what he wanted to be a cohesive Soviet Union, and so he took that opportunity to eliminate as many as he could.
And Erin, did he see it as a threat in addition to seeing it as an area that was very fertile?
Yeah, I think both for sure. But when they wouldn't acquiesce to what he wanted, then that became more of the threat, and it was eliminated. Yeah, but yes, everybody has wanted Ukraine soil for generations. That was part of the basis of World War II starting, was Hitler wanted Ukraine. It's an old sad tale, unfortunately.
I think many of us who have generational history of Eastern Europe have had a somewhat similar experience. And as I was reading your book, what was the most sad to me was not having had those conversations with my grandparents.
Yes.
Really understanding what their experience was when they came, not from Ukraine, but from other parts of Eastern Europe where they also had to leave or they were chased out.
Yes, I would give anything to have a conversation with my great grandmother now, knowing what I know and knowing what questions I'd want to ask her. It would be, it's
and why they didn't tell us, did they talk about it either? Mm-hmm.
so much trauma. And with the Holodomor, a lot of that wasn't passed on because it was dangerous to talk about it. There were many instances of people being arrested and sent to prison camps for 10 to 15 years for keeping a journal about it or for talking about it. So you did not speak about it. It did not happen outside of your little bubble. You could not talk about it even with your family members, but it was buried. It was trauma and it was dangerous to talk about. So.
If I could say one more thing and then I'll stop. Erin, I think you did a wonderful job of weaving the theme of secrets through the whole story. There were just so many layers of secrecy that were going on. So nice job with that.
Thank you.
Diane, you had something?
Yeah, yes. I just to follow up on what someone said before is that it's interesting that as difficult as this was to read, because it was, when you start empathizing with what people are going through, it's a difficult read. But it's funny, when I finished it, I thought, I don't mean to make light of it, but it's almost because of what that young lady said before, whoever it was, about you wish you would have had an opportunity to discuss with grandparents and great grandparents what they had lived in Eastern Europe, lived through. It's, to me, it was also felt like a feel-good story because of the connection between Cassie and her grandmother. The fact that she eventually had a chance to understand and to talk to her grandmother. She didn't have a lot of time to talk to her about it, but to me, that was a feel-good part of the story. But the family connections was feel-good part. But the connection she had with the grandmother and the discussion she had, an opportunity to finally talk to her and to get an understanding of something she never even knew existed before. To me, that was I even have goosebumps thinking about it right now.
That makes me happy.
It's a feel-good story. As difficult as it is to read, it's still, to me, about family and the connection between family members, you know.
I'm so glad you said that. That's was something I really wanted to have present in the book. Cassie's discovery and being able to talk to her grandmother, that's a story I wanted for myself, to be able to find that out and talk to her. And that the character Bobby is based on my great grandmother. So that is her. I mean, all the nuances, all the story. I mean, that was so for you to see that out of the book, that makes me so happy, because that was really important to try and portray.
And Roberta, did you have something else you wanted to say? Hope you're on mute. You're on mute. There you go.
You know, when we think about how that generation all acted to us, they were doing a good job. You know, now that we know what they went through. And I mean, that's probably why we didn't know more. And it was explained very well in the book. I had no idea. Well, I did have a clue probably 2/3 in, but if someone hasn't read it, I won't. But you know, other than that, I wouldn't have had a clue. But you did a great job, because we really, no one's left, at least, you know, from my family, so that there's nobody to ask anymore.
Yeah.
It's so hard.
Yeah. Yes, Sandy.
So it's a fabulous book. Thank you so much for it. And there's a lot of similarities today. There's a lot of similarities in a lot of the wars that have gone on over the years. And it's true. I mean, I'm going to have an opportunity at the end of March, I hope, to speak to a cousin of mine whose mother, who's now gone, was from Poland. And that's where my family's from. So very similar. They came over during the war, but I never heard anything about it. And apparently my aunt opened up to her daughter just before she died. So what I'm hoping to get is some of those stories and piecing some things together. And that's what you did in your book, Erin. And I think and they didn't talk about it because it was too painful. And I think if we've learned anything over the years, it's that the way of managing that pain for some people is to keep it to themselves, and for others is to talk about it. So, and I do a lot of historical stuff as well. And I have not been to Ukraine. It is on my list. I have been to Russia though. And a lot of things in Moscow reminded me of this book. And I was there before there was a whole lot of stuff going on. I'm not going back. But in so many cases, so many of us are the same worldwide. It's what the politicians and the warmongers and those people do to hurt the common people. And it is wiping out generations. I mean, Pol Pot did it in Cambodia, or he tried. You know, what's his name? Hitler tried to do it in Europe with the Jews and the Polish and all of that. So it was a remarkable story. And I immediately caught on that Cassie was really the granddaughter and Katya was really her story. But there was one part in the book, in mine, it's on page 393, or 318. This is when it's over. And after breakfast, they made their way to the wheat field near their house. There, Katya settled Halia with a girl who tended the children. But at the end, she says, sometimes she would think about what their lives would have been like together, but it hurt too much to do that often. He was gone from her life now. His memories, a sweet haunting melody that thrummed in her heart, but no longer pained her so constantly. She'd moved on in her own way because she had to in order to survive, but she could never forget him. And it is about the survival. Thank you for a fabulous book. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So other questions, because we're down to the last 10 minutes. And so, yes, Emily.
I don't have a question, but I wanted to say to Erin how much I enjoyed the book. And I thought that your chapters on Katya and Kolya, was it? Their struggle to survive were simply riveting. And I wonder if some of those things that you had in those chapters were the result of interviews with actual survivors. I just wonder, would you just think about eating bark off the trees and boiling leather for soup and that sort of thing? Or was that, were those recollections?
No, everything that my characters ate in the book was based on archival records of what people said they did eat to survive. So there was some pretty harrowing ones there. The one where I read about people who flushed water through vermin burrows to get out the little bits of grain that the mice would hide. That one was just shocking that you would think to do stuff like that, or the grinding the bark into flour to make pancakes with grains. Yeah, it was. Yeah, those were hard. That research was difficult at times. I had to step away, and it's an interesting thing. You know, I'd go make my family dinner after researching that all day, and my kids would not finish their meal, and I'm like, "You realize how lucky you are? Like, do not waste anything." It's just, it gives you a whole new perspective on how earlier how you said how fortunate we are, how lucky we are to live the lives we do because of the people who came before us.
You know, one of the things that reminds me of with eating the bark on the trees and that sort of thing is in Cuba, you know, and you know, because Katya's time was in Stalin's time, but in Cuba, 25 years ago, people were eating bark off the trees. And, you know, we don't realize that during what was called the special period, which was when Russia pulled out of Cuba and left Cuba with nothing, they went through their own starvation. It wasn't a forced starvation because Russia was coming in. It's because Russia left and left them high and dry. And they went through a starvation. And this is, I think that was like, 30 years ago. Wow. And yet we don't hear about that either. You know, so a lot of this is so cloaked in mystery because we don't know about it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what this book is doing, is it's saying this stuff happens, you know, and right. And I mean, so, but that eating the bark and some of the things that they did were similar stories to what the professor that I work with in Cuba, that he said when he was a young adult, what they had to do. It was the same kind of things. Yeah. to survive.
It's so sad that it's happening.
Yep. Well, I think this has been a great, lively discussion. Thank you all for sharing and joining in, and Erin, thanks so much for presenting a great book for us to have for the book club. Just wanted to let people know next month, which is because this month we have a very compressed month for our next book, because this was pushed back a week, and the third week in February happens to be a very early week in February. And our book then is Isabel Allende's Eva Luna. Is Eva Luna? Eva Luna. Sally, help me. Yeah. Now, this is a book. Isabel Allende has had many, many good books. This is one I have not read, nor has Sally. It is not set in a specific country. Okay. So anybody who's read a lot of Isabel's books in the past know that she is Latin American. She sets most of her books in Latin America. So this is in a fictional Latin American country. And so I'm hoping that it's a little lighter, so we originally were going to do Sandcastle Girls next, but quite frankly, to have two such books, one after the other, was a little too rough, So we're going to go with Eva Luna to kind of lighten the moods up, and then we will come back to Sandcastle at some other time in the future. Okay. And pardon?
What date is that book
That
club?
is February 15th, I believe.
Yes, that sounds right. And just a note for people, when you're getting the books, there are two books by Isabel Allende. One is Eva Luna, and the other one is called The Stories of Eva Luna, which is a spin-off or sequel to Eva Luna. So just be careful when you're choosing your book. It's actually the one called Eva Luna. And I'll pop a link again in the chat with the details of those books and how to sign up.
And we had many new people tonight. Hope that many of you will join us next time. We unfortunately don't have an author very often. We were very lucky tonight to have Erin with us. But what we do have lively discussions about the books amongst ourselves. We'll have prompt questions that we'll talk about for our regulars. You know how it works, but we have a number of questions, and we'll talk about the book itself. And for now, I'd like to thank Erin with our, thank you very much. And we really appreciate you joining us. And with that, we will call it a night and see you next month.
And thank you to Larissa as well for coming in. That was very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everybody. See you next month.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Night.
I'm going to stop the recording now.